The boy had been standing behind the dumpsters behind the closed hardware store for almost an hour. His legs shook from hunger. He had not eaten since yesterday afternoon, and even in tow it had been a half-crushed protein bar someone had dropped on the sidewalk. The cold wind coming down from the hills cut through his sweatshirt, which was 2 sizes too thin for winter. He stayed because the dumpsters sometimes held something edible. Most days, they didn't. Today they didn't. He heard a sound that made him think someone else was digging for scraps, and that thought made his chest tighten. But the noise wasn't human. It was a small, choked whine, a desperate shift of weight, a faint rasp of claws against concrete. When he found the puppy, the first thing he noticed was the smell of dried blood. The second was how light it felt when he tried to lift it. The little dog was curled tight, breathing with difficulty, and its right hind leg was swollen and bent at a strange angle. The boy didn't know much about injuries, but he knew bones weren't supposed to look like that. He knelt. His knees scraped on gravel. The dog tried to pull away but barely managed to move. Its ribs showed through patches of dirty fur. Its eyes were wide and glassy with pain, but they stayed on him as if trying to decide whether he was danger or a chance at survival. The boy whispered softly, not in words meant to soothe, but because his voice had grown weak from not speaking to anyone for days. He placed his hand near the dog, letting it smell his skin. The puppy trembled and then stopped resisting. It didn't trust him. It just didn't have the strength to run. There was a wet spot on the concrete beside it. Not fresh blood, older, darker, gummy. The boy guessed the pup had been lying there since the night before. Maybe hit by a car. Maybe kicked. Maybe both. The city didn't care much about strays. People didn't look down alleys. The boy wiped his nose with the back of his sleeve. The cold made it run constantly. He pulled the dog closer to his chest, terrified he might hurt it, but also knowing that leaving it meant it would die. He didn't have a plan, he didn't have a home, he didn't have food, but he had 2 arms and a little body heat left. He pressed the dog against his sweatshirt. The puppy whimpered once, a thin, broken sound, then leaned its head into the boy's collarbone. In the distance, down on the main road, an engine rumbled. Slow, heavy, the kind of sound that didn't belong to delivery vans or commuters. People in the area had a name for the men who rode bikes that loud. They didn't cause trouble, but they showed up when trouble happened. The boy had heard about them while drifting through shelters. Steel guardians. Some said they were ex-soldiers. Others said they were former criminals looking for redemption. The truth didn't matter to him. Men like that didn't notice boys like him. He adjusted his grip on the puppy and stood. His legs wobbled. The engine noise faded. It had nothing to do with him, he told himself. Nothing ever did. He looked down the alley. Snowflakes had begun to fall, drifting in the weak morning light. He had to move. The dog was getting colder, and he knew cold killed faster than hunger. He tried to tuck the puppy inside his sweatshirt, but the pain made the animal twitch and gasp. So he carried it with both hands instead, holding it close to his chest, pressing its side against his ribs to share whatever warmth he had left. Every step hurt. His feet were numb. His stomach cramped so hard he had to stop twice just to breathe. But he kept going, heading toward the abandoned bus depot where he slept some nights. There were broken buses there that blocked the wind. No one would help them, but at least no one would chase them away. Halfway down the alley, the puppy's breathing hitched again. The boy paused. He could feel its heartbeat fluttering too fast. He whispered that he was trying. Not a promise, just a fact. He was trying. A woman holding grocery bags passed at the far end of the alley. She glanced their way and immediately looked away. Adults often did that when they saw something they didn't want to be responsible for. The boy kept walking, but the weight in his arms felt different now, not heavier, just more urgent. The puppy was fading in and out. He reached the end of the alley and turned toward the depot. Snow gathered on the dog's fur. He brushed it off gently. The engine noise returned for a moment somewhere behind him on the main road, louder now, as if whoever rode that bike had slowed near the alley entrance. Maybe looking, maybe not. The boy didn't turn around. People didn't stop for him. But the dog let out a single weak bark, the first real sound it had made, and it echoed faintly, bouncing between buildings. The boy tightened his grip. He didn't know what was ahead, only that he had to keep the puppy alive somehow. He walked into the cold with a wounded animal in his arms and an empty stomach pulling at his insides. And behind him, far behind him, the low growl of a motorcycle engine lingered a little longer before fading back into the heavy morning air. By the time he reached the abandoned bus depot, his arms were shaking so badly he almost dropped the puppy. The depot sat on the edge of the industrial district, where people only came during the day and almost never looked around. At night, it belonged to whoever was desperate enough to stay. The boy squeezed through a gap in the rusted gate and slipped inside. The wind softened as soon as the metal closed behind him. 3 broken buses stood in a row, wheels sunk into the cracked asphalt, windows smashed, seats ripped out. He had tested each one over the last few months and had chosen the middle bus, less glass on the floor, less smell of mold. He lowered the puppy onto one of the back seats where an old blanket marked his spot. The dog whimpered when its injured leg brushed the torn cushion. The boy murmured without using his voice properly, just letting the sounds form in his throat. He moved the blanket, folded it twice, and slid it under the puppy's body to keep it off the cold vinyl. Before the dog, his routine had been simple. Wake up cold, try to warm his hands by stuffing them into his sweatshirt sleeves, leave the depot before the security guard from the factory across the road started his rounds, walk the streets until he found something to eat. Sometimes that meant waiting behind the bakeries for leftover bread. Sometimes it meant checking trash cans outside fast food places for whatever people threw away after taking 2 bites. He had been sleeping in the depot for a little over a month. Before that, there had been a room with peeling paint, a man who came home angry, and nights filled with footsteps in the hallway that made him freeze. Before that, there was not much to remember clearly. A shelter, different faces every week, staff turning over, kids coming and going. Someone had tried to place him in a foster home once, but it lasted less than a season. The last time he had gone back to the shelter to ask for help, the woman at the desk had said his spot had been given away and that he should have stayed in the program. Her eyes slid past him as she spoke, already on the next problem in line. He had walked out with his backpack half empty and his stomach clenched. In the depot, he checked the puppy's leg again. The swelling was worse. The skin around the break was hot and tight. He had seen injuries on people before, bruises on his own arms, marks on his mother's face when she was still around. But broken bones were different. They needed doctors, x-rays, things that cost money, things children like him did not have. He touched the dog's ear instead. The fur there was softer, less matted. The puppy's eyes fluttered open. It tried to lick his wrist, but the movement tired it quickly. He remembered the moment he had first really noticed hunger as something separate from just being empty. It was weeks ago when he had gone 2 days without food. The ache in his belly had become a kind of pressure in his head. Sounds had blurred, colors had dulled. A volunteer outside a church had handed out cups of soup, but he had arrived too late. All he had gotten that day was a plastic spoon someone dropped. Since then, he had learned to move slowly to conserve energy. He had learned that the worst part of hunger was not the pain, but how it made him think less clearly. That scared him. Now he felt that same fog creeping in at the edges of his thoughts as he watched the puppy breathe. He knew he should be out looking for food. The sun was still low but climbing. In a few hours, bakery bags would be carried to dumpsters, and if he timed it right, he might find something before the rats did. But the idea of leaving the dog alone in the broken bus made his chest tighten. Someone might come. Some older kid who knew he sometimes slept there, or one of the men who occasionally cut through the depot to cross to the tracks. People who saw weakness often wanted to take something from it, even if there was nothing worth taking. He rummaged in his backpack. There wasn't much. A pair of socks with holes at the toes, a cheap plastic comb, a half-empty water bottle he had refilled from a park tap, a crumpled flyer about a missing dog he had picked up near the bus stop days ago because the picture showed a happy child hugging a golden retriever, and for some reason he had wanted to keep that image. Now he saw the picture again as the paper unfolded in his hands. The dog on the flyer had a bright collar and clean fur. The little girl, smiling beside it, looked like she belonged somewhere. He studied her expression for a moment. It reminded him of how kids had looked in school photos when he still attended classes regularly, before his mother disappeared, before the man with the heavy steps decided the boy was a problem he didn't want. He set the flyer aside and opened the bottle. Carefully, he poured a little water into his cupped hand and offered it to the puppy. The animal sniffed and then lapped weakly. Drops slid down his wrist and onto the blanket. It wasn't much, but the dog's breathing eased slightly afterward. He tried to remember the last time someone had cared if he was hurt. It was too far back. A nurse at the shelter, maybe, or the teacher who had once asked why he always wore long sleeves. But questions had never turned into action. His bruises had healed on their own. The wind outside rattled the loose bus door. He glanced at the gap where the window used to be and listened. Distant traffic. A train horn. For a brief second, he thought he heard again that heavy motorcycle engine from the morning, but maybe his mind was playing it back. Sounds repeated themselves when you had little else to hold on to. He tucked the blanket closer around the puppy, then slid down to sit on the floor beside the seat. The cold seeped through his jeans, his back pressed against the torn vinyl. He pulled his knees up and wrapped his arms around them, but his eyes stayed on the dog. Routine had kept him alive up until now. Wake, move, search, eat if possible, find a place to sleep. Avoid certain corners, avoid certain faces. Never ask twice when someone said no. The system was not made for kids who slipped out of its lines. Today, the routine had broken. He had found a living, breathing creature that needed more help than he knew how to give. It was the first thing in a long time that looked at him like he mattered, even if that was only because he was the closest source of warmth. He thought briefly about walking toward the main road and trying to wave down a car. Maybe someone would roll down a window and listen. But he remembered the woman with the groceries ignoring him, the shelter worker turning him away, the countless times people pretended not to hear when he asked if they had leftover food. If they did not stop for a hungry boy, why would they stop for a boy holding a broken dog? His stomach cramped again, harder this time. He pressed his hand against it and waited for the wave to pass. The puppy made a quiet, strained sound in response, as if it could feel his discomfort. He rested his other hand lightly on the dog's side. Time slid by. He watched the light shift on the depot floor through the busted windows. At some point he knew he would have to stand up, force himself to go out and look for food for both of them. The thought of leaving the dog, even for an hour, made him feel exposed in a way hunger never had. The world outside the depot had already decided he was unnecessary. But in this small broken bus, a wounded puppy depended on him. That fact gave his day a shape, even if that shape was built out of fear and uncertainty. He waited until the dog's breathing settled into a rough, steady rhythm, then finally pushed himself to his feet. His legs tingled from sitting on the cold floor. He took one last look around the empty depot, memorizing every sound and shadow, trying to convince himself that nothing would change while he was gone. He nodded once to the sleeping puppy, as if confirming a silent agreement. He would come back. He didn't know how, he didn't know with what, but he would come back. Then he stepped out of the bus and into the thin winter daylight, carrying with him a new kind of weight that had nothing to do with his backpack and everything to do with what lay shivering on that torn seat. The cold outside the depot struck him harder than before. Hunger made his body slow and worry made his steps uneven. He kept looking back at the rusted gate, even though he knew the puppy couldn't follow him. There was a tightness in his chest he hadn't felt in years, something between dread and responsibility. He walked toward the bakery district because that was where the garbage trucks were always late. He stayed close to walls, unsure where danger might come from today. The city had corners where older kids waited for someone weaker. He knew most of those corners by heart. He avoided them as best he could. At the first dumpster behind a cafe, there was nothing but wet paper and moldy fruit. He checked anyway. He always checked. His hands shook with cold, and when he climbed back out, the tips of his fingers were numb. He pictured the puppy lying alone on the bus seat, chest rising and falling with difficulty. The image kept him moving. At the back of a grocery store, a worker dragged out 2 bags of unsold bread. The boy stepped forward cautiously, not wanting to be seen as a threat or a nuisance. The worker tossed the bags into the dumpster, brushed his hands off, and walked back inside without noticing the child at all. The boy waited until the door closed, then climbed up. The bread was hard and cold, but not spoiled. He ripped a roll in half and stared at it for a moment. His mouth flooded with saliva. He ate half quickly and tucked the other half inside his sweatshirt pocket. The puppy needed something, even if it was just soaked bread. He found a few more pieces that weren't moldy. He wasn't sure dogs could eat bread, but he remembered once seeing a stray chewing on crusts behind the same store. He gathered what he could and stuffed it into his pockets until he felt the weight against his ribs. As he walked back, the hunger made his legs feel as if they were filling with sand. The fog in his head thickened, but the thought of the puppy kept him focused. He imagined the dog's eyes when it had first seen him, not hopeful, not trusting, just desperate. No one else would help it. No one else would notice it. Halfway to the depot, a group of teenagers blocked the sidewalk. He recognized one of them by the red jacket with cigarette burns on the sleeves, a kid he had crossed paths with weeks ago and had learned to avoid. That time the boy had run. Today he was too weak to run fast. The group didn't move aside. They stood clustered near a bus stop bench, talking loudly. The boy shifted to the other side of the street, pretending to be just another passerby. But he felt their eyes follow him. One of them laughed. Another muttered something he couldn't hear. He quickened his pace. The bread weighed down his sweatshirt, making his movements awkward. He kept waiting for the shout, the footsteps, the chase. It didn't happen. But the possibility alone tightened every muscle in his body. When he finally reached the depot, he almost tripped, squeezing through the gate. His breath came out in clouds. He hurried to the middle bus and climbed inside. The puppy was awake but weak. It lifted its head when it heard him. The boy's chest loosened slightly at that small reaction. He broke off a tiny piece of bread, softened it with water from his bottle, and held it to the dog's mouth. The puppy sniffed, hesitated, then licked at the wet crumbs. He fed it slowly, careful not to let it choke. Then he ate the rest of the bread he'd saved for himself, chewing each bite longer than necessary, so the food would last in his mouth a little longer. When he finished, he slid down beside the seat again. The bus was colder now. The afternoon light slanted through cracks in the metal frame. The wind outside had picked up, pushing air through the holes where windows had once been. The puppy trembled. The boy moved closer and placed his hand on the dog's side. The warmth there was faint but present. He told himself he needed to think. Food for today was handled barely. But the dog's leg was getting worse. He could see it swelling, the skin stretched thin. He knew infections spread fast in cold weather. He considered taking the puppy to the clinic near the train station. They had posters offering low-cost services for animals. But he also remembered the sign taped to the counter that said appointments required, and the staff who told anyone without money to come back another time. He imagined standing there with a puppy that didn't belong to him, without an address or a phone number or a guardian. He imagined being asked questions he didn't know how to answer. Adults expected structure. He didn't have any. The boy rubbed his forehead. He tried not to cry, because crying made everything blurry and made the cold worse. Instead, he breathed slowly and counted the puppy's breaths. Eventually, exhaustion pulled at him. The cold seeped through his back and into his bones. He curled up on the bus floor, knees to his chest, his hand still resting on the dog, so he would know immediately if something changed. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. The sun lowered. The wind outside made metal sheets clang. Then the dog stiffened suddenly. A small, urgent sound escaped its throat. The boy sat up quickly, heart racing. He thought the puppy was in pain again, but then he heard it too. Footsteps outside the depot. Slow, heavy, and too deliberate to be passing by. He held his breath. The footsteps stopped near the gate. The boy's pulse hammered. Not many people came here unless they had a reason. Most of those reasons were bad. He gently pulled the blanket over the puppy, hiding it. Then he crouched low, listening. The footsteps moved again, not toward the buses but along the outer fence line, as if the person were inspecting the area. He heard the crunch of snow under boots, a faint metallic rattle from the gate. The boy pressed his back against the seat frame. His mind raced. If someone found him here, they might drag him out or yell or worse. People always assumed the worst about kids hiding in abandoned places. The footsteps paused again. Then something unexpected happened. A sound echoed lightly. Not footsteps this time, but a short mechanical click followed by the distant thrum of a motorcycle engine revving once. It wasn't the sound of a commuter bike. It was deeper, heavier, controlled. The same sound he had heard twice already today. The puppy lifted its head under the blanket, ears twitching weakly at the noise. The boy didn't know what it meant. He only knew the sound made his stomach flip in a way that wasn't hunger. Whoever was out there wasn't coming in. But they weren't leaving fast either. The cycle of fear, already familiar to him, tightened around his chest again. Danger didn't always arrive suddenly. Sometimes it waited, patient and quiet, just outside the thin walls of whatever shelter you tried to build. He kept his hand on the puppy, listening to every sound, every shift of wind, every crack of metal. The day was ending, and he knew the night would be worse. But he also knew he couldn't leave the depot again today, not with someone lurking outside, not with the puppy fading in and out beside him. He closed his eyes for a moment. He didn't pray. He didn't hope. He just waited for the world to shift. The same way he had waited his entire life. Slowly the footsteps faded. The engine rumbled one last time and then disappeared down the road. Silence returned. Heavy and cold. The boy let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The puppy pressed its nose weakly against his wrist. He whispered with a dry throat that they were still here, still breathing, still together, for now. Night pressed into the depot earlier than usual. The winter sky dimmed without warning, and the cold settled in with a kind of finality that made the boy's hands stiffen until he could barely curl his fingers. The puppy shook under the blanket, its breath uneven. Each exhale came with a faint whine the boy felt more than heard. He knew he needed more warmth, more food, something better than a handful of hard bread and an old blanket. But stepping outside again felt like stepping into an open space where anything could reach him. The footsteps from earlier stayed in his memory like a bruise. Someone had been checking the fence, someone with boots heavy enough to echo, someone riding a bike that didn't sound like anything common. He tried to push the thought away. He focused on the dog instead. The puppy's injured leg lay at an unnatural angle, swollen, darker around the wound. The boy cleaned it again with the corner of his sleeve, wiping away dried dirt and the sticky residue he hadn't noticed earlier. When the dog whimpered, he flinched. He whispered a soft apology even though he knew the dog couldn't understand. The sound was more to steady his own nerves. He sat back and pressed his palms together to warm them. The skin on his knuckles was cracked. Little cuts burned when he breathed warm air onto them. He flexed his fingers and waited for the sting to fade. His stomach cramped again. Worse than before. He curled forward, trying to ease the pressure. The puppy reacted to the movement, lifting its head slightly, trying to focus on him even through the haze of pain. The boy reached out and stroked the dog's neck. He told himself not to fall asleep. Not yet. He remembered the last time he had slept too deeply in a place like this. Someone had taken his backpack. Not everything in it mattered, but one picture had. His mother holding him when he was small, taken before the shouting, before the leaving. He'd never seen another copy. Losing it had felt like losing the last thing, proving he once belonged somewhere. He looked at the puppy and recognized that same fear, a fear of becoming invisible, a fear of slipping between the cracks so completely that no one would ever know he existed. A gust of icy wind pushed through the broken window frame. The bus door rattled. The boy hugged himself harder. For a moment he thought he heard the motorcycle again, low, steady, idling somewhere near the street. But when he held his breath and listened, there was only the hum of distant traffic and the occasional clang of metal shifting in the cold. He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the idea. Hunger could make sounds blur. So could fear. The puppy's breathing changed again, shorter, quicker. He placed his hand on its side. The warmth was fading. Panic surged through him, sharp and immediate. He stood up too fast, dizzy from hunger, and nearly fell. He braced himself against the seat. He knew he had to do something. He couldn't wait for morning. He paced the aisle between the ripped bus seats, trying to think of any place still open where he could find help without being questioned. The clinic near the train station would be closing soon. The men who sometimes gathered near the depot at night would have no use for a dog and would probably take what little he had. He considered the fire station 2 blocks away. They helped people sometimes, But walking in with no guardian, no story, no address, he knew what would happen. Child services, questions, shelters, the kind of places where pets weren't allowed, even broken ones. The puppy would be taken away. And if no one claimed it fast, it would disappear into another system as strained as the one he himself had fallen out of. He couldn't risk that. Not for himself. Not for the puppy. He stopped pacing. His breath hung in the air. Outside, the wind carried a faint sound. One he had heard before, but not from far away this time. A motorcycle, not passing, approaching. He moved toward the broken window and crouched low, peering through a crack in the rusted panel. The street beyond the depot was dimly lit. Snow blew sideways across the pavement. Then he saw it. A single headlight cutting through the dark, slow and controlled. The bike pulled to a stop near the fence. The rider didn't get off. Instead, they scanned the area with the quiet patience of someone who knew how to look for things people tried to hide. The boy's heartbeat thudded in his ears. He ducked down. He held his breath. He waited for the engine to fade again. But it didn't fade this time. It stayed, idling, watching the depot. The puppy whimpered softly, sensing the tension. The boy crawled back to its side and placed a hand on its head. The dog leaned into the touch, exhausted. The boy whispered that it was okay, even though he didn't believe it. 5 minutes passed, maybe 10. He lost track. Eventually the motorcycle pulled away, rolling slowly down the street until the engine dissolved into the night. He exhaled, shakily. Whoever was on that bike had reasons to circle this area. Reasons he didn't understand. Reasons that made his skin prickle. He looked at the puppy again. The dog's breathing was shallow, its eyes half closed. The swelling in the leg looked worse, almost purple now. Something inside him cracked then, a slow breaking point, not sudden but final. He couldn't watch the dog fade out like this. He couldn't wait for someone else to care. He couldn't pretend things would get better if he stayed hidden. He grabbed his backpack, stuffed the blanket around the puppy as gently as he could, and lifted the dog into his arms. It weighed almost nothing, but the responsibility of it felt heavier than anything he had carried before. He stepped off the bus, legs trembling. The snow had thickened. The depot was darker than usual, the shadows long and uneven. He tightened his grip on the puppy. The cold bit into his skin. His heart hammered an unsteady rhythm. He would go to the main road. He would try to flag down a car. He would risk whatever happened next because doing nothing was worse. He took one step toward the gate, then another. The puppy pressed its head weakly against his chest. At the edge of the depot, the boy paused. He listened. Far down the street, faint but distinct, that motorcycle engine again. Closer this time, steadier, purposeful. He didn't know it yet, but someone on that bike had been looking for a lost dog for days. Someone who had a daughter who hadn't slept since her puppy disappeared. Someone who wasn't circling the depot by accident. But the boy only felt fear rising. He clutched the puppy tighter and stepped into the freezing night, unaware of how close everything was to changing. The boy reached the sidewalk with the puppy pressed against his chest. Snow stung his face. Cars passed without slowing. Their headlights cut across him and kept going, like he wasn't even there. His legs trembled so badly he almost dropped the dog. He tightened his grip and forced himself forward. He raised one arm toward an approaching car. The driver looked straight ahead and accelerated. Another car swerved around him. A third honked sharply, as if he were an inconvenience, not a child in the cold holding a dying animal. The puppy whimpered, a thin, cracking sound that made the boy's throat tighten. Its breath came in small bursts against his jacket. He stepped closer to the curb, desperate, his eyes scanning for anyone who might help. His vision blurred once from hunger and panic. He wiped his face with the sleeve of his sweatshirt, leaving a faint streak of dirt on his cheek. Then he heard it again. Not a car, not the wind, the motorcycle, close this time. So close he could feel the vibration before he saw the light. The headlight appeared at the end of the street, cutting through the swirling snow. The sound was heavy, but controlled, not rushed, not careless. The boy froze. His grip tightened around the puppy, who shifted weakly at the sudden tension in his arms. He took a step back, ready to run, even though his legs could barely hold him. He knew nothing about bikers except rumors. Men who didn't talk much. Men who handled problems their own way. Men people avoided. The bike slowed. The rider's silhouette was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark jacket lined with patches the boy couldn't read from this distance. Snow collected on the man's boots as he stopped near the curb. The rider cut the engine. The sudden silence felt strange, like the world paused. The boy's pulse hammered. He shifted the puppy away from view, instinctively protective. The biker stepped off the motorcycle. He didn't move quickly, he didn't raise his voice. He stood still for a moment, studying the boy the way someone studies a situation before deciding whether to approach. A second bike turned the corner, then a third. They lined up behind the first, engines rumbling low before shutting off one by one. Steel Guardians. The name moved through the boy's memory like a warning. He had heard the whispers. He had seen the patched jackets once from a distance near the truck stop. They were the kind of men who lived by rules no one explained out loud. The first biker took a step toward him, then another. The boy held the puppy tighter, ready to bolt, even though he knew he wouldn't get far. The man stopped just an arm's length away. No words, no threat. Just a slow, deliberate movement as he crouched slightly to the boy's height. His eyes shifted to the blanket-wrapped bundle. The boy tried to hide it, but the man had already seen the shape. Another bike engine sounded from up the street and then faded as it parked. The newest rider climbed off quickly, much quicker than the others, helmet still on, shoulders tense. She looked smaller than the rest. Younger, not a child, but not old. She moved with urgency, steps fast, almost stumbling on the snow. Her jacket carried the same Steel Guardians emblem, but her posture was nothing like the others. She pushed past them, eyes locked on the blanket in the boy's arms. She reached him before he could back away. Her voice cracked, not sharp, not angry, just strained with something he didn't recognize. She reached toward the blanket with shaking hands. Inside the folds, the puppy stirred at the sound of her breath near its face. The girl stopped breathing for a second. Then she reached again, slower this time, and lifted the edge of the blanket with trembling fingers. The puppy blinked up at her. Her knees buckled. One of the older bikers grabbed her by the shoulder before she fell. She pressed both hands over her mouth, shoulders shuddering. Her chest hitched as a sob tore loose, raw, unfiltered, the kind that carried days of fear. She tried to speak but couldn't. Her helmet fogged from her breath. One of the men lifted it gently off her head. Snow clung to her hair. The boy stared, confused, unsure what had just happened. The girl leaned forward, hands shaking as she touched the puppy's face. The dog recognized her scent and nudged weakly into her palm, a faint movement full of exhaustion and pain. The reaction broke her. She cried openly now, not the loud kind, just steady, heartbreaking tears that made her shoulders shake. The oldest biker stepped closer. Lines of weather and age marked his face. His voice was low when he finally spoke, not directed at the boy or the puppy, but at the girl. She nodded jerkily through her tears. Her words came out broken, but they came out. She confirmed what the boy couldn't have known. The puppy belonged to her. It had run off days ago after a gate was left open. She hadn't slept since. The boy's stomach twisted at the realization. The puppy wasn't just a stray, it had a home, a family, a child who had cried for it. He looked down at the dog in his arms. He felt something break inside, not in a painful way, but in a way that tore open a space he didn't know he had. The oldest biker finally turned his attention to the boy. No judgment, no suspicion, just a quiet, steady look that made the boy feel seen for the first time in months. The man gestured toward the puppy, not to take it but asking permission. The boy hesitated. His fingers tightened involuntarily around the blanket. The girl noticed. She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the boy's wrist, not pulling, not demanding, just asking. Her touch wasn't heavy, it wasn't forceful. It was careful, like she knew how fragile things could be. The boy's throat tightened, his arms loosened. He let her lift the puppy. She held the dog against her chest, crying quietly into its fur. The oldest biker stepped closer, placing a steady hand on the boy's shoulder. The weight was firm, grounding. Another biker approached from behind, eyes scanning the boy's thin sweatshirt, his shaking legs, the dirt on his face. The empty look of someone who had gone too long without being helped by anybody. The first biker spoke softly to the others. They nodded. What happened next didn't feel dramatic. It didn't feel heroic. It felt like something that had been decided long before anyone arrived. One of the men walked back to his bike and pulled a heavy jacket from a saddlebag. He returned and draped it around the boy's shoulders without waiting for consent. Another guardian opened his pack and pulled out a thermal bottle, unscrewing the lid and handing it over. The boy stared at the steam rising from the cup, unsure if he was allowed to drink. The oldest biker nodded once, slow, reassuring. The boy lifted the cup with shaking hands. Warmth hit his tongue. Real warmth, the kind that stopped the trembling in his chest. Behind him, the girl held her puppy tighter as another guardian examined the injured leg, his face tightening with concern. The boy realized then that everything was about to change, not magically, not perfectly, but irrevocably. And for once, he wasn't facing the night alone. The warmth from the cup spread slowly through the boy's chest. His hands stopped shaking enough for him to hold it with both palms. Steam fogged his face, and for a moment the cold felt distant, not gone, just pushed back. The oldest biker stayed beside him, broad shoulders blocking the wind. His presence wasn't loud or demanding. It was steady, solid, the kind of steadiness the boy had never had from an adult before. The girl knelt in the snow, cradling her injured puppy. Her breath came out in uneven bursts as she looked over the dog's swollen leg. One of the guardians crouched beside her, checking the injury with practiced movements. He didn't rush. He didn't cause unnecessary pain. He worked like someone who had fixed worse wounds before. The boy watched, stomach tight with worry, even as warmth spread through his limbs. He whispered to himself that the dog was safe now. Not a promise, just a fact he repeated to keep from panicking. The biker examining the puppy finally lifted his head. He signaled toward another guardian near the bikes. A younger man jogged back to a saddlebag and returned with a small first aid kit and a folded towel. The girl's hands hovered anxiously as the man wrapped the puppy's leg to stabilize it. The dog didn't resist. It pressed its head against her wrist, exhausted but comforted by her touch. The boy felt his chest loosen slightly at the sight. The dog was no longer fading. It had someone who could actually help it. The girl wiped her face with the back of her glove, her eyes red from crying. She kept glancing at the boy as if trying to understand how someone so thin and cold had managed to keep her dog alive long enough for them to find it. One of the guardians approached the boy with a small bag of food, protein bars, a sandwich wrapped in foil, and a bottle of water. He offered it without speaking. The boy hesitated, looking from the bag to the biker's face, waiting for some kind of condition. There wasn't one. He took the sandwich first, unwrapped it carefully like it might disappear if he moved too fast. The first bite hurt his jaw. He hadn't eaten enough recently to chew easily, but the taste hit him hard, and he forced himself to slow down so he wouldn't choke. A few feet away, two guardians moved around the girl and the puppy, talking quietly. Their movements were deliberate, protective. They weren't letting cars get too close. They weren't letting strangers approach. They created a circle around the injured dog without ever making a scene. The boy had seen adults protect things before: property, cars, money. He had never seen adults protect a moment. The difference confused him. Another guardian, a tall man with gray in his beard, crouched in front of the boy. His voice was low when he asked questions, not pressing, not prying. Just things he needed to know. Where was the boy staying? Had someone hurt him? Was there a guardian nearby? The boy answered quietly, avoiding eye contact. He didn't give details. He said enough to explain, but not enough to be sent somewhere he didn't want to go. The biker listened without interrupting. He didn't flinch at the parts most adults avoided hearing. When the boy explained that he had been sleeping in the depot, the man nodded as if that made sense. Not because it was acceptable, but because it matched the reality of too many people he had met over the years. The oldest biker approached then. His jacket bore more patches than the others. His eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen things he couldn't unsee. He spoke quietly with the man who had questioned the boy. They exchanged a few words the boy couldn't hear. Then the oldest guardian turned to him. He didn't reach out, he didn't crouch, he didn't try to make himself look non-threatening. He just stood there, big and calm, giving the boy time to breathe. He said they weren't leaving him there. Not tonight. Not with the temperature dropping, not with someone having circled the depot earlier, something the Guardians had already picked up on. The boy stiffened. His instinct was to pull back. Adults promising help usually meant rules, systems, questions, doors closing behind him. But the Guardian didn't make a promise. He made a statement. The girl approached then, still holding her puppy. She stopped in front of the boy, her breath visible in the cold air. She didn't speak, she didn't smile. She just stood there with her dog pressed against her chest, eyes wet but steady. The puppy lifted its head weakly when it saw the boy. It reached out with its nose, trying to nudge his hand. The movement was small but clear. The boy touched the dog gently, afraid of hurting it. The girl watched, her shoulders trembling again, but this time from emotion and not fear. One of the bikers knelt beside her and secured the puppy against his chest in a warming sling made from a thick scarf and the towel. He checked the dog's breathing again. Then he stood and jerked his chin toward the bikes. They needed to move. The cold was getting worse. The dog needed proper care, not a makeshift fix in the snow. The oldest Guardian turned to the boy once more. He asked if the boy could ride. A simple question, not pressure, just possibility. The boy hesitated. The idea of getting on one of those loud, powerful machines terrified him, but the cold pressed harder. The hunger twisted deeper. The night felt wider than usual, and the depot felt like a place he couldn't go back to, not after the footsteps, not after the fear, and not after someone had circled it on purpose. He nodded once. The oldest Guardian placed a hand on his back, steady, careful, nothing like the hands he had known growing up, and guided him toward one of the bikes. Another Guardian opened a spare jacket and helped him into it. It hung heavy on his shoulders, swallowing his frame, but it held warmth he hadn't felt in months. The girl secured herself on the bike, carrying her puppy, keeping one hand on the dog's back the entire time. Engines ignited one by one. The sound vibrated through the pavement, deep, controlled, unified. The boy climbed onto the bike behind the oldest Guardian. The man checked his grip, adjusted his hands so he wouldn't fall, and then gave a quiet nod to the rest of the group. They pulled out together, tires cutting through thin snow, headlights carving a path through the dark. The boy held on, the warmth of the jacket and the steady rhythm of the engine, keeping him grounded as the city blurred past. He didn't know where they were taking him. He didn't know what morning would bring, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't moving through the night alone. The bikers rode in formation, steady and close enough that the boy felt protected without understanding why. Snow drifted across the asphalt as they turned into the side street behind a mechanic's garage. Warm yellow light spilled from the open bay door. The air smelled of oil, heated metal, and something cooking on a small electric burner inside. They parked in a row. The engines shut off one by one, leaving a thick quiet behind them. The boy sat still for a moment, hands locked around the oldest Guardian's jacket, unsure if he should let go. The man waited, giving him time. When the boy finally loosened his grip, the biker held his arm for balance as he stepped down. Inside the garage, a portable heater hummed near a workbench. The girl sat on a folded blanket with her puppy in her lap, while one of the bikers called a veterinarian they trusted, someone who didn't ask unnecessary questions and didn't report every stray child or broken situation he encountered. The boy stayed near the doorway at first, unsure where to stand. His clothes were damp, his hands were cold again, but the jacket they'd given him kept most of the warmth in. He watched the girl rock gently with the injured dog pressed against her chest. The puppy was still breathing unevenly, but its eyes were more focused now, tracking the movements of the people around it. A Guardian handed the boy a new cup of something hot. Broth this time, lighter than soup, easier to drink. He wrapped both hands around it and sipped slowly. The heat spread through him in small, careful waves. No one asked him to explain himself. No one demanded details of where he had been living or why he was alone. The questions that hung unsaid in the room stayed unsaid because the Guardians understood something others didn't. Not every truth needed to be dragged out immediately. The vet arrived within half an hour, a tired-looking man with worn gloves and a steady walk. He examined the puppy on the blanket. The girl hovered anxiously, her fists clenched in her sleeves. The boy stayed a few steps behind her, heart pounding, afraid the vet might say the damage was too deep. But the man worked quietly, checking the leg, the swelling, the dog's breathing. When he wrapped the limb with clean bandaging and prepared a small injection for pain, the dog only whimpered lightly. The girl held its head gently between her hands. The vet finished, wrote a short list of instructions on the back of a scrap of paper, and handed it to the guardians. He said the puppy needed rest, antibiotics and monitoring, but the break was something he could treat properly in the morning at his clinic. Not hopeless, not lost. The girl exhaled shakily and leaned over her dog, tears gathering again, but softer this time. She thanked the vet without lifting her head. The boy stepped back, a strange emptiness spreading through him. He had kept the dog alive long enough for it to reach its real owner. That should have made him feel relief. It did, partially. But it also left a space in his chest he didn't know how to fill. The oldest guardian noticed his distance and approached. He didn't ask if the boy was okay. He didn't use comforting words. He simply stood beside him and waited until the boy looked up. He told the boy quietly that the girl wanted to speak with him. The boy hesitated. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and walked toward her. She shifted slightly, making room for him near the blanket. The puppy lifted its head when he sat down. Its tail twitched once, a tiny movement, but enough to break the tension in the room. The girl didn't smile. She didn't force anything. She just said in a low, steady voice that her dog wouldn't have survived the night without him. Her hands shook as she spoke, not from fear but from relief that had taken too long to arrive. The boy nodded once, unsure what to say. He rested a hand lightly on the puppy's neck. The dog leaned into his touch, recognizing the warmth it had depended on. The girl watched the gesture. Her expression softened. A guardian brought over a crate of clean blankets. Another placed a plate of simple food on the workbench: bread, eggs, a piece of fruit. The bikers worked around the garage with unhurried efficiency, making space without drawing attention to the boy or the girl. They had done this before. Maybe not this exact situation, but situations like it. When the vet left and the garage settled into a calmer rhythm, the oldest guardian suggested the boy stay for the night. Not as a request, not as a command. As a plain fact. The temperature outside was dropping, and no one was sending a hungry child back into an abandoned bus. He pointed to a small office in the corner of the garage, where a cot stood folded against the wall. A heater hummed quietly inside. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't a permanent fix, but it was warm, and it was safe. The boy nodded slowly. He didn't know how long he would be allowed to stay. He didn't know what would happen in the morning, but the cot looked like something he could sleep on without waking up shaking. Before he left the girl and the puppy, he touched the dog once more. The puppy licked his fingers weakly. The girl watched the moment closely. She whispered that she would come find him in the morning so he could help her take the dog to the clinic. Inside the small office, the boy removed the heavy jacket but kept it close. He lay on the cot. The blanket they gave him smelled of detergent and machine oil, not of mold or cold metal. The heater's steady hum was the closest thing to comfort he had felt in months. Exhaustion sank into him. His eyes drooped. He slept before he could think too much. 2 weeks later, he was still there. Not permanently. The guardians didn't trap people in promises, but they made sure he had food every day. They checked the depot once and told him plainly it wasn't safe. They took him along on errands when he felt up to it. They asked a local community group to help him get documents he'd lost years ago. The puppy's leg healed slowly under proper care. When the girl brought it to the garage on weekends, it limped toward the boy first every time. She never tried to stop it. She just watched the two of them with quiet understanding. They didn't call him family. They didn't call him a case. They didn't call him a burden. They just kept showing up. Some nights he sat near the garage door, wrapped in a borrowed jacket, listening to the growl of engines as the guardians returned from long rides. He didn't understand their world, and they didn't ask him to. Their presence alone was something steady enough to hold on to. He didn't get a perfect ending. Life didn't suddenly fix itself, but he wasn't invisible anymore. The girl often sat beside him with her puppy curled in her lap. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they just listened to the bikes cooling in the cold air, metal ticking softly. The dog would nudge his hand each time, seeking the warmth it remembered, and the boy would rest his palm gently on its fur. Alive, healing, home. The guardians didn't say it out loud, but their actions were clear. When no one else showed up, they did. Follow the channel for more stories from the Steel Guardians.